Have you fallen in love with your Alocasias, Colocasias, Caladiums, otherwise known as elephant ears, but you're still kind of stuck on a bit of its care? Stick around and I will show you my tips on how to keep things happy and growing and getting huge. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me. It's tropical houseplants. So today I'm going to talk about one of the genuses that is very near and dear to my heart, or a couple, more than a couple actually, genuses that are near and dear to my heart, which are Alocasias. And let me see if I can bring another example up. And then Caladiums. And unfortunately, I don't have the third one at the moment, which is Colocasia. So I don't think that Alocasias, Colocasias, or Caladiums need a lot of an introduction. Most people go gaga for the leaves. And obviously, some of these are kind of the bigger type Alocasias. There are smaller Alocasias, which are called dual Alocasias. This is an example of it. And for some reason, I am forgetting the name of this one. And I'll add it, is it sinuata? Potentially, I'll add it at the top there. There's things like the black velvet Alocasia, there's a dragon scale, there's a silver dragon scale, there's loads. Colocasia, you've got things like the Pharaoh's Mask. I think that's a Colocasia, not an Alocasia. You've got the black magic. You've got the black something else, which was a bit of a debate between the black magic and black velvet is different. But anyway, there are loads of different ones. So Colocasia could be the Colocasia mojito as well. That's another one that a lot of people tend to go for. And obviously, the Alocasia frydek, or Miss Galiciana, not frydek, because I've done a whole video on this puppy here, but this one is wrongly been called the frydek for a while. The frydek is a variegated version. I'm going blue in the face saying this. This is the standard green form, which is the Miss Galiciana. But, right, the thing with all of these, they have got usually that one name that everybody calls them by, which is elephant ear, and you can kind of get why. And I'll bring it back down. I need to keep putting these things away and maybe just leave them out for the video. But you can kind of see why it is called an elephant ear. And before anybody asks about this specific Caladium, this is spring fling. Spring fling. Words. Hard. But this is spring fling, and the reason why I like it is when it first comes in, it is kind of a pale white color, and it goes this pinkish color, and it's a shame that it's such a dark day, but you might be able to see, can you see when I'm moving my hand behind it? Hopefully there's enough light that you can kind of see through the leaves, which I find absolutely hysterical with this one, because the only green that I can see is on the kind of veination of the leaves. Everything else has not got a color, but grows really well. This was fully dormant a month and a half ago. I've had this plant for 3 years, I will say that. So, and it's had a couple of dormancies with me. So it's taken a while to get to this bushiness, but really cool Caladium. But yeah, it makes sense why they're called the elephant ears. It's the shape of all of this. And you can also understand why there are such popular houseplants, because there's loads of different shapes, sizes, colors, and they really are quite impressive. Obviously, the Caladiums, they can get quite big as well, but the biggest ones by far will be your big Colocasias. Some of the Alocasias can get absolutely huge as well. If I'm not mistaken, the way that you can distinguish between an Alocasia and a Colocasia is, let me pick up this Alocasia again. Can you see that the petiole is there? And the leaf is pointing down, so that's where it joins the leaf there with the petiole. With an Alocasia, it would be pointing up. So not Alocasia, Colocasia. The Colocasia will point up, the Alocasia will point down. So the kind of end or apex of the leaf, I think, needs to go down for an alocasia. For a colocasia, it will go up. Not constantly and all the time from what I've seen from my own colocasias, but that is usually an easy way of distinguishing between the two of them. But overall, why am I talking about all of them at the same time? Their care is very similar. And there's loads of alocasia care videos out there. I'm not going to be another one that's saying predominantly the same things, but I will tell you what has worked for me. And to be clear, I have been growing Colocasia and Alocasia successfully since I was about 5. My mother is still growing hers. One of, I think, her Alocasias is probably, Colocasias, is probably my age. And I'm nearly 40, so they are quite interesting plants, as long as you get a couple of things right, at least in my experience. So let's go into light requirements first. All of these plants, and I've got them all, you can kind of see some of the tips of them here. All of these plants, technically what everybody says is they need bright indirect light. Yes. But a few hours of direct light do wonders for your alocasias. And this was my alocasia frydek, which I kind of chopped and propped, and I will give an update on this whole situation in a while. It's what happens when I decide to film on a Monday because the weekend was too busy. Brain is not engaging. Disturbing that it's a Monday and it's not the weekend, but you know. So this was chopped from my previous plant, and I think the only reason why I did that is because I wanted to experiment, and this is a lot easier to find these days, so I'm just like, if it goes horribly wrong, then I can always replace it. But it has gone well. But the thing that I was going to say is, when it comes to light with these plants, yes, everybody's just like, you know what, give them bright indirect light. But every time I've put them in south-facing windows without net curtains, yes, you do run the risk of them burning. Bear that in mind and do it at your own risk. But the growth is exponential, and I will see if I can add a picture here of what that frydek or the Miscaliciana alocasia looked like just after a couple of years of having it in very, very bright light. So you should be able to see quite how large it got, and a lot of my alocasias got huge. So, and again, I'll see if I can add some more pictures or videos from other alocasias that I had grow large. The reality is, the reason why I have less of these alocasias and colocasias at the moment is because I'm kind of limited in space in here. If I had 1 or 2 big statement plants that I wanted to add, I would add those. I do have a lot more of the jewel alocasia because yes, these can get bigger, but they don't get ginormous like some of the other alocasias. The colocasias, you can grow indoors as well. They're fine. I've talked about in other videos. Some colocasias are also edible. They do so back home in Cyprus, and they are tasty, tasty, tasty. And I know a lot of places around, usually the Far East, I think, use alocasia, or sorry, not alocasia, colocasia. I still think the alocasia isn't edible, but the colocasia is. If you know differently, tell me. But yeah, with light, that bright indirect thing is, yes, they will be happy. My experience, the more light you give them, the better. Do not put them out in the garden in direct sunlight. They will fry. So I have also tried some of my alocasias outdoors for the summer and then brought them back in. Those are always under a tree. So I put them so that they are fully shaded by a tree, because bright indirect light in the house means shade in the garden. Remember that. So the way that you could do it, just to kind of help manage it a bit more, if you're going to put it somewhere in bright light, at least here in the UK, our bright light isn't that bright most of the time. But if you are in places where it's constantly sunny around the world and you get loads of light in your window, at that point, you might want to have it in a south-facing window in the summer. but with a net curtain or something in front of it. If you are slightly more northern like I am in the UK, you can pretty much leave it without a net curtain for most of the summer, especially if it's grey summer days like today. But if you do know that it's going to be a scorchingly hot day, it's good to have that net curtain to be able to pull in front of it and keep it happy. Now, I've talked before about using a light sensor app on the phone. Some people agree with it, some people don't. I use it, I still find it quite useful just to give me a benchmark. I know it's not the full scientific tool because that's expensive and you can buy it separately, and it's a PAR reader, photoactive radiation, I think it is, where it shows you quite how much of that light can be used by the plant to photosynthesize. But with the light sensor, what I would say is find a place where your plant, especially if you know that Alocasias are growing really well in certain places, just go and use your phone and check what it's reading at that point and try to emulate that in your space. If you are worried that it's not getting enough light, check where you've got yours. Like for instance, if I had my frydek here and I was checking it now, it wouldn't be bright enough, I would move it closer to the window. Things like that. But give it light. It loves light. So coming into the watering needs of this specific type of plant, basically, because they're all basically grown from what is, this is called, and this is quite a large one, this is called a corm. So think of it as a tuber basically that just grows very pointy and upwards. And that's the bit, by the way, when I'm talking about some colocasias are edible, it's this bit that is edible basically. That and the root essentially is what I think it's just the part that's under the soil that is edible. But, and there's specific ways, don't kill yourself, talk to somebody who does cook this in their own culture and they'll be able to make a nice meal for you or explain to you what you need to do. But when it comes to watering with these plants, this is the big game changer as much as it is for light, but the watering is quite interesting. So you might be able to see here, I've got my Caladium in a chunky aroid soil mix. You might be able to see with this specific dual Alocasia that I have got it in leca, in semi-hydro. You might also be able to see that with the frydek, I have got it in lettuce pond in a net pot with a reservoir. All of these things work. Now, Colocasias and the Caladiums tend to do really well in soil mixes for me. I will also say that I haven't tried those in something like a semi-hydro, mainly because my Colocasias and my Caladiums, at least here in the UK, will almost go dormant. So that is something that we need to talk about, but I'll touch on that just a bit later in the video. But they do appreciate the soil mix a lot more, and it's less of a faff because if you've got it in soil, you can leave the tubers in for the dormancy period and you basically pull back on the watering entirely as long as you remember to start watering again in spring. With the Alocasias, however, and it's interesting because when I was doing my own research online to see what everybody else was saying, is that the Colocasias are the ones that grow near rivers and kind of moving water. But I think from what I was seeing ages ago, the Alocasias do the same as well. They tend to love water. Do not keep them sapping wet, especially if they're in a soil mix, but these plants will grow naturally near waterways. So you can understand kind of the water level that it needs. Now, with something like a semi-hydro, and you can see a lot of people will have them in pond or they will have them in something like the leca, is because it provides a lot of aeration, and if you've got a reservoir as well, it will create that kind of level of moisture that it needs. Now, this is the bit that a lot of people struggle with, because what you'll get a lot of the times is, oh no, I've lost a leaf and I've only ever had one leaf on my Alocasia. I only ever had 2 leaves on my Alocasia. Every time a new one comes in, the other one dies off. Now, and again, most of us have said this before, But this usually triggers a few people. And I'll tell you about my tools, basically. If you don't want to do it, don't do it, basically. But this is what has worked for me. So something like a moisture meter is exceptionally important for me, especially if I'm growing in something like a soil mix. And this helped me along the way in the beginning. Now it's a bit more intuitive for me, but what happens is, especially with Colocasia and Alocasia, every time they're pushing out a new leaf, like what is happening here, and I keep putting things down and pulling them back up again, so you can see a new leaf there, I filled this water reservoir up yesterday, and usually it takes it a couple of days to clear out. It is a bone dry. And that is something that I've noticed, and that is something that you need to keep in mind. This is the slightly babying side of having an alocasia. In order for it to not reject the old leaves in favor for the new leaves, and you end up with a situation where you only ever have 2 leaves on a plant, basically, is that you need to remember the watering. And that's usually what happens. It will reject the oldest leaf if it's too dry when it's trying to get the new leaf. And it makes sense. Think about it. This is what happens with a lot of our other plants as well, not just with the alocasias. You just don't think about it in the same way. Because if you've let something dry out for way too long, the plant will still be okay and salvageable and you can water it and it's fine. But sometimes when you do that, what happens? Or before you even water it, after you've let it dry out for too long, you might lose a couple of the lowest leaves to yellowing. And that's when you get yellowing due to underwatering, because what the plant is doing is it's sacrificing its oldest leaves to keep the new leaves at the top going. Make sense? Makes sense. Which is essentially what the alocasia is doing. You just need to go with it with this one. So if it's growing a new leaf actively, check it more often. Use your moisture meter a lot more often. So if on average you know that you're watering that specific alocasia in a soil mix once a week, the moment that you see a new leaf coming in, start shoving this in there and see what the meter reading is saying. Because what you might get is 3 days into the 7-day wait that you would have had to check with the water, it's already bone dry because it's using up all that energy for the leaf. Water it. And that's the thing that I would say, when it's actively growing the leaves, it needs to be watered more frequently because it's using up more of that water. If you let it dry out for too long, it will then sacrifice that older leaf for the new leaf. And you will end up in the situation we were just talking about where you only ever have 2 leaves. So in this situation, and I know a lot of people get alocasias because they think that they're easy plants, and they can be, as long as you know kind of some of these things to keep them happy. Yeah, like you kind of, this is the bit that you need to baby them. If you want to have a nice big plush plant with loads and loads of leaves and it retains all of its leaves whilst it's growing that new leaf, you kind of need to do that in the beginning. The reality is, I will say, after growing some of my bigger alocasias for as long as I did and as large as they got, there is a point where if you've got like 8 or 10 of the old leaves and then you've got a new one, if it rejects one of the leaves because you've missed the watering, you've still got loads of leaves on the plant. So, but yeah, watering is key with these plants. Coming into temperature and humidity. And temperature is an interesting one, and it affects arguably the Colocasia and the Caladiums more than it will do the Alocasia, at least in my experience. And we recently touched on this topic on a video of mine where everybody assumes that they're doing the right thing by forcing their Colocasia or their Caladium into dormancy. Bear with me with this, where all of these tropical plants are growing. The difference between the winter season and the summer season is not huge. So generally in nature, they don't get dormancy. They just keep on growing like they would year round. So they don't need the dormancy. They can go into dormancy, and it's a survival tactic that they might have, but they don't need it. So just bear that in mind if you're trying to force a dormancy onto a plant. So generally speaking, as with most houseplants, both the Alocasia, not both, all the Alocasia, Colocasia and Caladium like things to stay above 15 degrees Celsius if at all possible. And I know a lot of people give a top range for kind of heat, but I will be honest, as long as I've had plants growing happily for a long period of time in up to 40, 45 degree heat. And as long as I keep up with the watering and the humidity isn't dust, basically, so it's not like 0 or 10%, they're fine. That top range is interesting, but arguably the winter one, the lower end of the scale, is what you really need to be aware of. And what I will say is that's generally when you'll start seeing both the Caladiums and the Colocasias start going into dormancy. And it's when it drops beneath those lower levels. The Alocasia, I found, can take temperatures that are slightly lower as well without going into dormancy. Very rarely have I ever had an Alocasia go into dormancy, or have I ever forced an Alocasia to go into dormancy. So that is something to bear in mind. But yeah, 15 upwards is a good temperature for all of them. If you go below 15, the Caladiums and the Colocasias will start going into that dormancy phase. Humidity is an interesting one because, as with most plants, I have found the Caladiums that have got the very, very thin leaves, and the same thing goes with the Alocasias. The bigger Alocasias that are not the dual Alocasias tend to have thinner leaves. This one is relatively robust, but nowhere near as turgid as something like most of the dual Alocasias. They've got very almost fleshy type leaves. They are a lot better, I found, not all of them, so the black velvet Alocasia, because it's got that velvetiness, it needs slightly higher humidity, but some of these more, the ones that look a bit more like dragon scales and they're a bit glossier and kind of thicker, they don't need, from my experience, they don't need that high level of humidity all the time. And by high level of humidity, I mean 60, 70, 80%, they don't. These could be okay down to 50, I find. The thing that you need to remember about humidity with any of these plants, the Colocasias, the Alocasias, and the Caladiums, whether or not it's an Alocasia that's a dual Alocasia or one of the larger ones, is pests. And as we're on the topic of pests, let's dive into the big one for all of these, spider mites. People that have been struggling with this for a while knew that this was coming. So yes, Alocasias, Colocasias, and Caladiums all will suffer from spider mites at one point or another. If, and I would love it if somebody could tell me this. If you can honestly come down in the comments and tell me, you know what, I've had my Caladium, Colocasia, Alocasia for 4 or 5 years and I have never once had spider mites. Just amazing. Just absolutely amazing. Not once having spider mites on something like that is spectacular. Big congrats. But for a lot of people, these are very similar to your kind of calatheas and your prairie plants in the terms of the fact that spider mites, I love them. You can occasionally, if you've got mealybugs near them, you might get the occasional mealybug. I don't think I've had any significant thrip damage on these before, but spider mites. And I will say this about any of these. Spider mites will happen when the humidity level is very dry. So there is that to remember with your Alocasias, Colocasias, and Caladiums. Is if the humidity goes really dry, the plant itself might not suffer, but you are more likely, at least in my experience, to start seeing things like spider mites crop up significantly, and they can go fast on any one of these plants. So, a couple of things that I would suggest there is, if you can, and depending on how much you want to baby your plants, especially if you've only got one of these and you don't have like an army of them, around the summertime when you're watering it, try taking it outside in the garden or in the shower or in the bathtub and shower it down, the leaves included as well as the soil when you're meant to water it. Then if there's any chance of any of the spider mites coming out, you are flushing them off the leaves quite quickly at that point. More importantly, without using things like pesticides or neem oil, because I know a lot of people don't like either of these things. So this is the most natural way of doing it, is just by knocking them off by just giving them a shower, essentially, on the leaves front side and back side. And at the same time, the plant can get watered. The other thing that you could do, and this is my preferred method because I have a lot of these plants and they are near other plants and I cannot be bothered to be showering them every time I need to water them, especially in the summer, get something like predatory mite satchels. Satchels, not the dust that you powder over it. Sometimes it might be cheaper, trust me. Don't waste money. Get these things, put them on at the beginning of the summer, refill them at least once or twice during the summer, as in get new ones in, and you will not have it because they will protect you against the spider mites. At least they have done in my experience, and I know that this isn't an option to everybody because not everybody can purchase predatory mites. In that case, that showering down that I was talking about would be my big suggestion to you, and keeping an eye on the pest situation generally. So, a couple of extra bonus tips that I would have overall. So the one thing that I will say, and some people get really nervous, especially if they've never owned a Caladium or an Alocasia or anything like that before, where you might get the water droplets happening at the very tip of the leaves. That is normal. It is called guttation. And I have done an entire video where I talk about a lot of these scientific things here. You can click to find out. But it's nothing for you to necessarily worry about. The other thing to bear in mind with this is you might sometimes get nodes that are happening around these growing stems. I was trying to see if any of those could be activated. The answer is no. I think when I took these cuttings, I took ones without the growing tips at the top as well. And none of them have really activated. I don't think, I'm trying to think if this one was. I'll see if I can find a picture and I will put it at the top there. But I think these were all top cuttings of previous stems, basically. There are ways that you can propagate an alocasia. So Emma from Good Growing, and I will link her channel down below. If you don't already know Emma, go check her videos out. They're amazing. She does the shallow puddle method. So that's a good way of kind of propagating your alocasias. They also generate things called little baby corms. So I don't know if you can see that one growth point there. That wasn't a cut that I put in there. That is a brand new one, as is that one right there. So that is the easiest way to propagate an alocasia, because if you've got a corm in the growing media that's already shooting up, as long as you can kind of take it out and remove it and put it somewhere else, you've got a new alocasia. It is not as easy as me going to philodendron, cutting it out, cutting the stem essentially and putting it into some soil, and then I know that I will definitely have a new plant. At that point, you kind of have to wait for the corms if you want to do it that way. The other major difference that you might be able to see from something like a Caladium, at least from what I can see, is they grow very similar to like crawler philodendrons. So the growing point is always at the bottom and they shoot out a new petiole and a leaf, but they don't get tall and go upwards. Alocasias and Colocasias will get their corm to start growing out of the soil, and it kind of looks like a pseudo stem, and you get the leaves at the top. As I mentioned, obviously, with the dual Alocasias, they can stay quite petite as well. So these will start getting some height, but they don't get absolutely ginormous. I think I've seen some Colocasias and Alocasias that could be a few meters high, basically. So so it is one of those things. Also, the same thing goes with, as with most plants, if you've had an Alocasia and a Colocasia for a long period of time and you've got a corm, like my mother's had hers for nearly 40 years, basically, they're absolutely ginormous. They're established plants. At that point, even if they go into dormancy, which is when they lose all their leaves over the winter and then they grow the leaves back in the spring, Those plants are relatively robust. They've been there for a long time. They've got an awful lot of energy stored within those corms, because think of the corms similar to what you would use for something like tulips or anything like that. They're kind of bulbs, essentially. They're a glorified, I think, they're pretty much like a glorified bulb. So they will store a lot of that energy in the plant. And I tend to go with that method that if things are going to go into dormancy, like things like caladiums that will almost go into dormancy in the UK in the winter, I will never go in and cut the leaves. Similar to the thing that they always tell you with bulbs, leave, so is it hyacinth? I think it's a hyacinth. I love hyacinth. So when you get that big flower spike at the top and you get all those little beautiful flowers that smell divine, and you get the kind of really plain looking grassy leaves, when that flower is done, a lot of people just chop it back and they just go back, let's put it in the soil and it'll come back next year. They don't always, and if they do, they come back a bit weaker. You kind of need to maybe take the flower spike off, but you need to leave those leaves on there because that's what's replenishing the energy of that bulb in order for it to grow the next year. So usually what the suggestion is with that is let those leaves absorb as much energy as they need, and then they will kind of die back down into the bulb for the winter and they will grow back stronger than the next year. I follow the same method with any of these Alocasias, Colocasias or Caladiums. If they're going to go into dormancy, I will let them naturally go into dormancy. I will not go in at the end of the summer and chop everything back. No. Let it crisp up. It won't look great, but trust me, this is what I've done with this year and year again. And when I first got it, it was literally, can you see that one leaf there and there? That's how small it was. And it just comes back bigger and bigger every year. So that's my top tip to you for that one. Let them go into dormancy naturally. Do not force it. Yeah. Coming into my final thoughts and conclusions. Are these amazing plants? 100%! Do I think these are beginner plants? No. In an ideal world, you kind of need to have had experience with Alocasias, Colocasias or Caladiums before, or if you don't and you're just getting into your houseplant journey, start with something simple and something kind of easy to replace. Like I think the Alocasia, which one was it? Alocasia? I am drawing a blank. I will add it at the top there. It's the kind of standard green Alocasia that you'll get from most places, and it can turn into like quite a substantial plant. Basically, start with something like that, and then progress to the rest essentially as it goes along the way, because you need to know that you can keep that happy. If you can keep that happy and growing, you can grow most other Alocasias, Caladiums, Colocasias. Similar care requirements. So as long as you can do that and you can keep multiple leaves on there, you're doing something right. But do not be hard on yourself. These can be a bit of a challenge to get used to in the beginning. I had a friend who got the Alocasia mystiliciana frydek, and if she's watching it, hi. And she was a bit worried, but actually she's grown it quite nicely. She's had her ups and downs, but she's learnt along the way, and that is the way of the Alocasias, Colocasias, and Caladiums. You learn along the way, and if you haven't fallen out of love with it because it's not something that you want to baby and do all these things, and you're still interested in it, you will get better for it with time, but it is one of those things that hopefully videos like my one might help, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You're going to need to go through your own experiences to learn some of this, and you will find what works for you in your space. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. I've done a couple of Alocasia kind of care videos. I will see about possibly putting a link somewhere on here or maybe at the end of the video, and you can check some of the older ones. Please do not cringe. Those are very, very old videos. But you can tell this is a kind of a good couple of genuses of plants that I really do care for quite a lot, and I still love them. I always have some form of an Alocasia, Colocasia or Caladium in my collection at any given point. I just don't have as many of it now because they just get too big, and I kind of want to keep space for some of the other bigger plants that I have at the moment. And that might change in the future. But I've always said, and this is quite telling, this might tell you something. If I was to not have my collection and just have a few houseplants in my home and not have a huge crazy plant person collection, again, Colocasias or Alocasias would definitely be on there. 100%, I would at least have one of them. So they're very, very cool plants, and they are very show-stopping. They are definitely kind of wowy, kind of look at that plant in that space being really kind of domineering. I like that. It might not be for everybody. If you like nice, delicate, kind of like plants that can be quite discreet, maybe Alocasias and Colocasias are not for you. Possibly some of the Caladiums and some of the jewel Alocasias, maybe. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Give me some of your top tips down below in the comments. If you've got anything that's different to mine, I'm happy for us to have differing opinions. They are all valid here. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.